Now, Steenhuisen also says the party will unite with all forces in South Africa opposing the ANC and the EFF. Steenhuisen will lead the DA in next year's general elections. The party also saw the re-election of Federal Council Chairperson Helen Zille. Steenhuisen believes the country's citizens don't see the party as just an opposition, but as a government in waiting. Let's unpack what happened over the weekend further. I'm joined by political analyst Dr Ongama Mtimka. Thanks, Doc, for your time here on eNCA. Not a surprise when it came to the leadership race in terms of the position that John Steenhuisen remains in, because he was going against Mpopalazi. A lot of people would say it's not a surprise that he came out on top. But, South Africans reacting to the fact that there's only one black face that you're seeing in the top structures of the DA. Is it a fair analysis? Should we get over it as South Africans in terms of the identity of the DA?
Sure. Good morning to you and your listeners. Thank you for having me this morning. So I think that the race can be judged on its merits, the race between Mpopalazi as well as John Steenhuisen, in the sense that she needed to marshal an army of campaigners at a national level. And to run against the incumbent, her campaign needed to be introduced a lot sooner than it was. And so, in the same way that in the build-up to Mangaung, Kgalema Motlanthe announced his candidature very late, candidacy very late towards the conference. So we can construe this as a tactical blunder. However, that is not the same for how the entire leadership looks of the party. The issue for me is that what we see as an outcome, where it's mainly white and male leaders that are there in the DA, is a reflection of what happens when you choose not to be intentional about representativity and diversity. And the party just doesn't get this, how important it is to ensure that if it wants to attract the majority of the support base of the country, that it is actually transformed to reflect the demographics of the party. For that, you do not only need a laissez-faire approach in terms of the campaign, but you also need a degree of intentionality in ensuring that, for example, the running mates for Helen Zille, John Steenhuisen are people who are black, who are colored, who are Indian. So that doesn't have. We see that when you choose neutrality, you choose the status quo. Neutrality is not neutral. Neutrality favors the powerful and the dominant.
And on Saturday, during the time that they were, trying to lure voters, these two candidates, during the time when they were still candidates, John Steenhuisen and Mpopalazi, it clearly didn't work much for the doctor to bring up the fact that she's a qualified doctor and she's got all these degrees, while Steenhuisen, as we know, we found out a few years ago, at that time didn't even have a matric. So that clearly didn't work for her.
But that's an important point.
Yeah.
So, from a rational choice perspective, the DA voter should be a maximizing voter who says, and if we are to follow liberalism proper, who says, out of these two candidates, who presents the party with the best in terms of potential and skill? And that's not even a matter for debate. That you have an outcome that's not optimal from a rational choice perspective shows you that the whole idea of liberalism is deeply flawed, in the sense that it seeks to advance the idea that the choices are going to be made on the basis of merit, when in fact it is the political maneuvering and the politics of the day. And the politics of the day in the DA post 2019 are politics of reclaiming the DA for the white voter base.
Now, Doc, let's talk about, Helen Zille. In that position, she did have somebody who was up against her, somebody who's from a branch of the DA in the city of Tshwane. She then pulled out not only of that leadership race, but two other positions. But what does it say about the party as a whole, even its members, to find that a Helen Zille went into this Congress unopposed in that position?
Well, it does happen very often. I think that the candidates who could have potentially challenged her read the balance of forces, read the mood, and decided not to contest her. That's part of what happens in a democratic period, in democratic processes. So there's nothing wrong with that. Where, for me, I find fault is the lack of strategic foresight on her part. The same way, by the way, I argued that by insisting on continuing to govern, the senior politicians in the ANC were lacking strategic foresight to set the party free from their overbearing politics and allowing a younger generation of leaders to redefine the party and present a different proposition to voters. I think that Helen Zille, in being lured by her power, has lacked strategic foresight here to unshackle the Democratic Alliance of the politics of her generation and those before her. And by her continuing to be there, it clouds the potential of the DA to actually assume a new identity beyond cult politics, if you like.
And Doc, looking at the fact that this was basically the start of the DA's campaign towards next year's national government elections and how they performed back in November of 2021, they didn't perform very well during that time, and they still re-elected John Steenhuisen into that particular position. In some areas where they are the leader of a coalition, things have fallen apart, particularly in the province of Gauteng, etc. And John Steenhuisen, after accepting yesterday, after being announced as the leader that will continue to lead the DA, talking mostly about the EFF and the ANC. Does this still resonate with South Africans? I know they're the official opposition and they should actually point out some of the things that don't work in the governing party, etc. But is this, narrative still going to work and resonate with the electorate?
Strategically, it was ill-advised of John Steenhuisen to stand on a party platform and cite an opposition party as their public enemy number one, instead of the governing party, when judged from the perspective of electoral politics. In fact, what it does is it elevates the perceptions of radicalism about the EFF, as opposed to, and decampaigns the ANC to some degree. One of the strategic blunders that he makes in his speech is the assumption that the EFF, the ANC, if it gets into a coalition environment, is going to be it's going to need either the Democratic Alliance or the EFF, when in actual reality is that it may not in the first period of coalitions in South Africa. It may simply need 3, 4, 5 smaller parties in order to clinch a coalition. So as such, this Swart Gevaar thesis that John Steenhuisen is advancing is deeply flawed, because you may find that the ANC, which is a very centrist or to center left party, might find greater comfort in Action SA or in Rise South Africa or in Busa. I don't think the ANC strategically is going to want to go into to seek a coalition with either the Democratic Alliance or the EFF, precisely because those parties are campaigning on the extremes as far as ANC policy is concerned. Whereas these new splinter parties of the DA particularly may present the party with more moderate ideas with which to explore coalitions.
Well, it's going to be quite an interesting election, and at least one thing we can say about the Democratic Alliance is that they were on time when they promised that they would announce leaders and they would announce results at a certain time. They actually did that. My last question is twofold. Just firstly, what you make of the fact that the party decided when it announced the results that it would not announce the numbers in terms of how many votes a person got compared to the next. And insiders telling some media organizations that it was a landslide by John Steenhuisen, people mentioning 84% of the vote going to John Steenhuisen and only about 16 to Mpopalati. What do you make of that? Was it probably a strategy for the DA not to embarrass anyone so that they can still keep those people within the party and they're not shunned on? That's my first question. And lastly, will a federal state work in a country like ours? Because that's what the DA essentially would like.
That's plausible in terms of your first question. It's plausible that they may have wanted to not embarrass these candidates and therefore create present a brutal landslide. I'm willing to accept that might have been the rationale, even though somebody else may see it as lack of accountability to the delegates. When it comes to federalism in South Africa, what's interesting is that our system is already built to provide more services to lower structures, but using a competency-based model for that instead of a carte blanche approach. So, for example, with respect to housing and policing, there is a degree to which powers can be devolved. I think that what the DA should explore a lot more is further devolution of certain powers to provinces, because indeed there are provinces that will show greater competences than others. But imagine provinces where you have a radical change from a unitary system. Imagine those provinces that actually do not have the competences to deliver some of the functions that would be devolved to them under a federalist state. So it shouldn't be this pursuit for a one-size-fits-all approach. The approach that we have already established within housing and policing is the approach that we should be exploring, of a competency-based approach to devolving state powers rather than a carte blanche federalist approach.
Dr. Ongama Mtimka, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA, political analyst there, just giving us what he thought about the DA's Congress that happened over the weekend.